This meeting is being recorded.
So welcome back, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce now Rachel Cooper from Lancaster University. Rachel is well known to everyone working in philosophy of psychiatry, I'm sure, but she's the author of Classifying Madness from Springer in 2005, which I think was based on her PhD. And then 2007, Psychiatry and the Philosophy of Science, published by Acumen, and 2014, Diagnosing the DSM with Carnac. Numerous papers in philosophy of psychiatry. Today, she's going to talk to us about puzzles in the logic of psychiatric classification. Handing over to you, Rachel.
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, an apology. Something's gone wrong with my PowerPoint. So we have a suboptimal display, but hopefully we'll get by. Thank you very much to the organisers for organising such an interesting conference, and also for inviting me. And thank you to all of you for coming along. It's really lovely to be able to interact with so many people from all around the world doing interesting things.
Sorry, Rachel, just to interfere, we don't see you at the moment. Can you put your camera on? Is that okay? Or if you don't want to, then you can just speak without it.
I'll give it a go. Sorry.
Yeah, there we are.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now I need to get my slide back. Can you see the PowerPoint?
It's all good now with the PowerPoint, yeah.
Yep, okay,
No
good. Right, thanks very much. Yes, so today I want to think about some puzzles in the logic of psychiatric classification. What I mean by the logic of classification is the basic kind of principles around classification in psychiatry. The work I'm presenting is something I've only started working on seriously fairly recently. So I'm looking forward to your feedback and help with it. So can you see that slide okay, or do I need to make it slightly?
Actually, no, it's you will need to make it smaller, I'm afraid. Yeah, now we can see it. Yeah,
good.
Oh, perfect. Yeah,
right. So classification occupies a central role in psychiatry, so you can think about the importance of the DSM. So this is a picture that I've stolen from the internet. I think it's interesting that the image that I found, it's clearly like a very well thumbed book. They've got this idea that the DSM is something which is used all the time. So diagnosis is taken to be important for understanding what's going on. It's taken to be a key to determining what treatment someone might need. It's taken to be important for shaping research studies. The idea is that it's going to be key to understanding the etiology of conditions and so on. So psychiatry looks to be a discipline where classification plays a crucial role. Superficially, when you look at something like the DSM, it looks as if classification in psychiatry is kind of like classification elsewhere in science. So the DSM looks a bit as if it was a classification that you might find in biology or in some other area. But I want to suggest in this talk that in crucial respects, classification in psychiatry is really quite unlike that in other sciences, and that might be the core issue that means that psychiatry experiences certain problems that some other sciences maybe don't. So just to set out the structure of the talk, I'm going to talk first of all and quite briefly about how classification might work in other sciences. Then I'm going to explore three puzzles to do with the basic logic of classification in psychiatry, and then talk about how this might shed some light on how it is that psychiatry or psychiatric science is unlike other sciences. So you can think of lots of sciences, or at least some sciences, where classification seems to enable us to gain control over a domain. So it can enable explanation and prediction. The image on the left is from the basement of a natural history museum. I think it's the one in Washington. So with natural history museums, as well as the main building that you take children to and you can go and see dinosaurs, they also have collections of biological specimens. What you've got here, hopefully you can see, I think this is part of their seaweed collection. So they've got files, they've got actual specimens from different species, and this enables some understanding of biological organisms. So if you find a seaweed and you're not too sure quite what it is or what to do about it, you can send it to a natural history museum and they'll be able to identify it. They'll be able to tell you what species it is, and that will enable some prediction as to how it might behave. So once you know what species it is, they'll be able to tell you whether it's edible, for example, how big it's likely to grow, what kind of conditions it will thrive in, and so on. Chemistry is obviously another area where classification enables explanation and prediction in a domain. So all atoms of an element are the same and they all behave the same. And so classification in chemistry enables explanation and prediction to be successful. Now, the question is, well, how does this work? There are massive debates in philosophy of science about natural kinds, exactly what counts as natural kinds, what kind of characteristics natural kinds have to have. Talk of natural kinds has become encrusted with quite a lot of metaphysical baggage. So some people will claim that natural kinds have to have essences or to be universal, all kinds of things. There are people who will talk about kind of messier kinds, and this is particularly common when people are thinking about classification in philosophy of psychiatry. So people will talk about cluster kinds, non-essentialist kinds. I think Dan Stein yesterday was talking about soft natural kinds. The basic idea, like the root and important idea, is that domains can be such that individuals in them can be naturally similar to each other and then can be expected to behave similarly. So when philosophers talk about there being cluster kinds or non-essentialist kinds, maybe in psychiatry, the idea is that you can get at least fuzzy groupings where cases of mental disorder can be grouped together and then they can be expected to behave similarly. And there are areas where the idea that domains are split into groupings that are naturally similar to each other is hugely plausible. So with this draw of types of beetle, it looks like you've got 3 different kinds of beetle there and that those individuals are naturally being grouped together. And then these classifications can provide a template for explanation and prediction. So in chemistry, the idea is that atoms of an element are alike, and so they're going to behave the same. Biology is a bit fuzzier, but we've got the idea that organisms of the same species are alike, and so can behave similarly. And then the question is whether something like this can work in psychiatry as well. And I've put red questions marks over this because this is one of the questions that I want to consider today. So is it the case that we can expect cases of a mental disorder to be alike and so to behave similarly? And there are different reasons for doubt. So with the papers yesterday, the speakers were stressing how much heterogeneity there is with most kinds of psychiatric conditions. So there's that kind of set of worries. That set of worries comes out of the emerging empirical evidence that suggests that there's messiness and complexity at every level. In this talk, I'm going to be considering a rather different set of problems, which are more conceptual problems to do with what kinds of things we think mental disorders are and how we think they might be counted. So in this talk, I'm going to be exploring 3 puzzles around psychiatric classification. So these are puzzles to do with what I'm calling the logic of psychiatric classification, the basic principles of how classification in psychiatry is supposed to work. I take these puzzles to be interconnected in the sense that your answer to one affects your answers to the others. I think they're fundamental and that they've been neglected, and that looking at them will highlight some key differences between psychopathology and other domains. So the first puzzle concerns what the basic units that are classified by a psychiatric classification system might be. So I think we can think of classification as supplying a set of pigeonholes, and then the basic units that are being classified get put in the pigeonholes. I don't know how well you can see this picture. This again is part of a collection in a natural history museum. This is the parrot section. And you've got the curator who has got lots of drawers, and each drawer stores specimens of a different species. So here we've got the drawers of the pigeonholes. They correspond to the species. The basic units are individual dead parrots, and they are being sorted into these different drawers. So this is a case where we've got a biological classification system, and the things being classified are concrete organisms that you can grab hold of and put into boxes. When it comes to psychiatry, it's less clear, if you're thinking of a classification system, what the basic units that are being classified are actually supposed to be. It might be that they're abstract disorders that can somehow be distinguished from the people who have them. So it might be that disorders are things that people have. Or it might be that the classification classifies kinds of people, or Adolf Meyer, who I'll talk about a bit more later, talked about reactions, which was supposed to be the way in which a person responded to their environment. So it might be that disorders are ways that people are. It's not too clear exactly what the basic units that are being classified might be. The second puzzle has to do with how we might individuate disorders. And so philosophers talk about individuation. That's the question of how you can count how many disorders there are. So in cases where someone satisfies criteria for 2 or more diagnoses, so they meet multiple sets of DSM diagnostic criteria. The question is, well, do they have 2 or more disorders, or is there just one complicated problem there? So that's the second puzzle. The third puzzle concerns how and whether we can distinguish between the person who has a mental disorder or suffers from mental distress and their illness. And there are some cases where we do seem to want to draw a distinction. For example, you can consider a case where someone has a manic episode and they say some hurtful things. I think it would be quite normal for people to want to brush those off. So we might say something like, oh, that's the illness, that's not the person speaking. So there are cases where we draw a distinction between the genuine person and their illness. But there are other cases that seem tougher. So it's unclear to me whether you can distinguish between a person and their personality disorder. If you take the case where someone has antisocial personality disorder and is really cruel, it seems quite odd to say, oh, that's just their illness. Deep down, they're a kind person, really. So that's the third puzzle. Now, I want to convince you that the answers to these puzzles are connected. And the way I'm going to try to do that is to review 2 alternative paths you might take and show how they come as package deals, how your answer to one question influences your answers to the others. I'm going to be looking at two ways that we might go. I'm looking at two ways just to illustrate that there's multiple different possible answers and that the answers to the puzzles are interconnected. These two aren't the only possibilities. So the first way one might go is one might think of disorders as something which as abstract processes that can somehow be conceived of apart from the people who have them. So you might think of disorders as being things that people have. They're going to be abstract. You're not going to be able to grab hold of them. You're going to have to somehow abstract them away from the people who have them. So with this way of thinking, the vision is one where there's a way that a person could have been expected to be, and then something's happened, and that leads to a set of symptoms. So we have a picture of what a typical person would be like, and then there's some kind of perturbing cause and some kind of symptoms that come out of that. When we're thinking about the disorder, we think about what that's like by abstracting it away from how the person would otherwise have been. So we can think about the etiology, the cause, some underlying pathological mechanisms and symptoms, and that's the disorder, which can somehow be abstracted away from the people who have it. There might be some cases where it looks like the best way to make sense of what's going on is to postulate that there are two disorders, or maybe three, all co-occurring within the same individual. In that case, we imagine that there's a way that the typical human would have been, except that there's been more than one perturbing cause, which leads to more than one symptom cluster. There's quite a famous review of classifications that was written up by Stengel in the early 1960s. So in the early 1960s, Stengel was asked by the World Health Organization to review the various different classifications that were then circulating in psychiatry. And in his review, he talked about how different classifications had a different basic picture of the relationship between people and their illnesses. Stengel talks about the kind of picture that I've been describing, where we think of a disorder as something that can be abstracted away from the people who have it, as being based on a relation between a person and his illness in which the former acts as a host. So I'm describing that as a kind of parasitology model. The thought is that in the same kind of way that someone might happen to host two parasites, maybe a flea and a tapeworm, it might just so happen that one person can suffer from more than one disorder at a time. So someone might, for example, have a phobia of spiders and also, say, an alcohol use disorder. If you go down this route, then when you're trying to distinguish between the person and their disorder, you think of the disorder by abstracting it away from how the person would otherwise have been. And then the genuine person is what's left once that's happened. So we imagine what the person would have been like without the disorder and count that as the genuine person. Something like this seems to be the approach taken by the DSM. There's a fairly well-known and recurring passage that occurs in the introduction where the DSM states up front that it's a common misconception that a classification of mental disorders classifies people, when actually what's being classified as disorders that people have. So the DSM conceives of itself as classifying disorders, and it distinguishes that from a classification of people. In the DSM, typically people can have multiple different diagnoses. There's this picture of diagnoses as things that can co-occur. And the language employed is one where it talks of individuals with antisocial personality disorder or individuals with anxiety and so on. So you've got the idea that the person and the disorder should be distinguished. So that first path looks to be the approach that's adopted by the DSM. But there's a different way of thinking about these issues. A different way of thinking about classification in psychiatry is to think that fundamentally what's being classified is either kinds of people or ways that people react to stress. So they're classifications of ways that people are. Then the basic units would be whole people, or maybe the reaction of someone to their environment. If you think of things in this way, then when one person meets multiple sets of diagnostic criteria, there aren't really distinct multiple abstract disorders that can be classified and put in different pigeonholes. All there is one person who's facing a complex problem. If you go down this route, then the idea that a person might be distinguished from their illness isn't going to seem like a viable option. So when the illness is the way that a person is or the way that they're responding, it isn't the sort of thing that can be abstracted away. This, I think, is the approach to classification that was adopted by Adolf Meyer, who was a dominant figure in the US in the early to mid 20th century. There's a very interesting work by a historian that came out comparatively recently by Lamb, where she's explaining Meyer's approach. One of the problems with understanding Meyer is that his own published writing is really hard to make sense of. So he was a massively important figure. He trained lots and lots and lots of psychiatrists, but understanding his own work is quite tricky. So Lamb in her book says that on his approach, it turns out that types of persons are difficult to define, and that once and for all we should give up on the idea of classifying them as we classify plants. Rather, he had an approach where the way to understand what was going on was to rely on detailed individual life histories. Each individual faced a set of complicated problems that couldn't be abstracted away from the way that they were. So he's a figure that followed this second path that I'm sketching. Now the question is, well, which way of thinking about things is right? And one way to approach this question is to consider a case where one patient meets multiple sets of diagnostic criteria, and to think about how we might decide whether there's one person with a complex problem or two or more abstract disorders coexisting in the same person. Now, I'm a philosopher. It shouldn't be too surprising that I'm going to argue that there's no straightforward answer to this question. So in the world, there are interacting and complex causes, symptoms, problems, behaviours, and there are no clear dividing lines that show us how and where the problems faced by someone experiencing mental illness or mental distress might be divided up. So there aren't any lines out there in the world. Rather, it's going to be a matter of deciding how to divide things up. In the philosophy of science over the last few decades, there's been a lot of interest in the role played by models in science. So Ronald Gere is a key figure. He has looked particularly at the role played by models in physics. He argues that the theories of physics aren't literally and directly applicable to concrete objects, but rather to idealized models. To take an example, in mechanics, physicists will come up with laws about how a harmonic oscillator will behave, but the claims they make aren't directly and literally true of any particular physical pendulum, for example. rather they're true of an idealized model. There's a great deal of abstraction and idealization that's required. You have to suppose that there's no friction, that the mass is all concentrated at a point, and so on. So the approach in the philosophy of science that emphasizes the importance of models, it's an approach that emphasizes the importance of idealization and abstraction. It also emphasizes how there can be different models that might be used for different purposes. Which model to apply comes down to a matter of choice. In the philosophy of medicine, Jeremy Simon and Dominic Murphy have both argued that it's going to be useful to think about diagnoses and disorders as applying to models. I want to mention a book which is coming out really soon by Sam Fellows. So Sam Fellows has just finished a postdoc here at Lancaster. He's developed a neo-Kantian approach to thinking about psychiatry. So it's an approach which really talks about the importance of modelling and idealisation and abstraction. His book that is coming out really soon is called In Defence of Psychiatric Diagnoses. So this is something that he's been working on a lot. Okay, so the thought is that in the world, there aren't any dividing lines that will tell us how we can distinguish between a disorder and the individual who has it, and how we can distinguish between disorders so we can count how many someone might have. This is going to be something which is going to depend on how the situation is modelled. In other words, the dividing lines are a matter for decision. This decision is going to be guided by empirical facts, by theoretical considerations, but I think it's also partly an ethical decision. So let's take an example to illustrate. I want us to consider a case where someone has Down syndrome and they're bullied, and this makes them afraid to leave the house. To pluck up courage to socialise, they start to drink and take drugs. So we suppose that they meet 4 different sets of DSM diagnostic criteria. They meet criteria for Down syndrome. They also meet criteria for social anxiety disorder, for alcohol use disorder, and for drug use disorder. So they meet 4 sets of diagnostic criteria, but I think we can still ask the question, well, how many disorders do they really have? And there's different ways you might go. You might say, well, if they meet 4 sets of diagnostic criteria, that's the end of the question. That just means that they have 4 distinct disorders. Or I think you could argue that the alcohol and drug use are kind of manifestations of the same issue. They're varieties of substance dependence. The person's using these substances to pluck up courage. They might be treated together. So you could say, look, there's Down syndrome, there's social anxiety, and then there's substance dependence. Or you could say, well, the drug and alcohol problems are really just a symptom of social anxiety. That's actually the approach that the very first DSM took. So in the first DSM, alcohol use was generally understood just to be a symptom of some other underlying mental disorder. If you take that approach, you might say, really, the person just has Down syndrome and then social anxiety, and then this drug and alcohol use is just a symptom of the social anxiety. Or you might say, look, all of these issues are interconnected. It's not useful to try to split them up. This is just one person with a big, messy problem. Now, when it comes to deciding how best to model what's going on, there are empirical considerations and theoretical considerations. So one type of consideration that might move us would be causal. we might well want to distinguish between Down syndrome and social anxiety disorder on the basis that they have different causes. That kind of thought links in with the question of what kinds of treatment might be appropriate. So quite often, if we think that different subsets of a person's problems have different causes, that might lead us to think that different treatments are going to be appropriate, and that might be one reason for splitting up what's going on. Linked with causal considerations also are temporal considerations. Even if we don't really know what the underlying causes are, if someone is a particular way for their whole life and then at some point in time something else happens, that might be a reason for thinking that there are two disorders going on there rather than just one. So there are empirical and theoretical considerations, but I think that moral considerations also come into play. The flip side of being prepared to think of disorders as things that can be abstracted away from patients is that you then have the remainder as being the genuine person. There are some psychiatric conditions where that doesn't seem problematic. So if someone has a brief psychotic episode as a response to taking some drugs, it seems fair enough to somehow abstract that period and those behaviours away from how they really are and to discard them. Problems emerge, though, when it comes to psychiatric conditions that are lifelong and affect aspects of personality and emotion that seem to be central to identity. If we try to think of personality disorders or Down syndrome as autism as things that can be abstracted away from the person who has them, then the worry is that we wouldn't have very much left over. An additional complexity is that it looks like the domain of psychopathology just is very diverse. And there are different types of conditions where we might want to model what's going on in different ways. On the one hand, there are brief disorders with clear causes. So, for example, brief psychotic states that emerge as a response to stress or drugs. Those look quite different from lifelong and deep-seated conditions like autism, personality disorders. And then there are also messy disorders where they seem to intermingle and where comorbidity seems to be very high. When we're thinking about how it's best to individuate between disorders and the people who have them, and how it's best to split up and count disorders, it looks like those different types of condition might best be dealt with very differently. I never quite know how to pronounce this name. Maj, there's an interesting paper on comorbidity where he notes that it's likely that the nature of psychopathology is intrinsically heterogeneous, consisting partly of true disease entities and partly of maladaptive response patterns. And so that, I think, is one issue. It looks like psychopathology is just very diverse, and that there isn't going to be one basic logic that's going to be applicable across the whole domain. So it's very hard to know how the domain of psychopathology can best be modelled, partly because, as I said, it looks like it's a heterogeneous domain with very different kinds of things in it, partly because there's a lack of theoretical knowledge, and also because I think this question of how best to distinguish between people and disorders links in with difficult ethical questions around responsibility and authenticity and autonomy. And those questions, I think, get interlinked and are just incredibly hard. So I think that there are difficulties here, and that these underpin some ongoing issues. I think we don't really know how to best make sense of the domain of psychopathology, how best to count disorders, how to distinguish between people and the disorders that they have. And this links into the crises in psychiatric classification. So this links into why it is that comorbidity rates seem very high, particular issues around personality disorders, where again, comorbidity rates seem very, very high in ways that are odd, and where there's also this problem of how and whether it makes sense to try to think of these as conditions that can be abstracted away from the people who have them. These difficulties also link into why it is that psychiatry seems in some ways more problematic than some other areas of medicine. So the question of how to individuate disorders, how to count disorders, is especially difficult in psychiatry for a number of reasons, partly because understandings of etiology are limited. And in addition, all the disorders are kind of located in the brain or manifest in behaviour. In other areas of medicine, sometimes the etiology is fairly well known, and so you might distinguish between different conditions because they're caused by different viruses, for example. You might distinguish between disorders because they seem to affect very different bodily symptoms. Can't you say bodily systems? So if one disorder seems to be affecting your toe and another's affecting some other area, that might tempt you to think that they're distinct. In psychiatry, that's harder because everything is located in the brain. And in psychiatry, there are particular problems around issues of distinguishing between the self and the illness, because psychiatric conditions can plausibly affect aspects of personality or what someone wants to do, where it becomes very, very hard to distinguish what's the person and what's their illness. Also in psychiatry, there are deep ethical questions. So the question of, well, what counts as the disorder, what counts as the person, links in with perennial questions around responsibility and autonomy. I think this set of issues also helps illustrate why it is that classification in psychiatry, although it may kind of superficially look like classification in other areas, in important ways is more problematic. So in lots of biology, not all of biology, but quite a lot of biology, biological organisms are entities that you can grab hold of and put into boxes and that can be counted. In contrast, when it comes to counting or delimiting mental disorders, things are much, much more problematic. Okay, so by way of summary, I've explored 3 connected puzzles. So the puzzles are what the basic units being classified might be, whether they're abstract disorders, whether they're people, how disorders can best be individuated, how they can be counted, and the problem of how disorders and people can be distinguished. I've argued that these puzzles are interconnected, that the answers to them depend on how we think it's best to model people and their problems. There aren't answers out there in the world. It's going to be a question for decision. Empirical and moral considerations can both play a role in determining how it's best to model what's going on. I think these issues are important, that they've been neglected, that there's no easy answers, and that they explain some of the current crises in psychiatry. So that's it. Thanks very much. I'm looking forward to your comments. If you want to contact me, my email is r.v.cooper@lancaster.ac.uk. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel. That was excellent. So we've finished with plenty of time for Q&A. We'll take our normal 5-minute break, put your questions in the chat, and then we'll go through them. So we'll be back in at 5:45.
Okay, thank you.